What happened tonight was not simply a political or military event. It was an economic rupture, the kind that reshapes the foundations of a society. A nation that has relied on a carefully built system of trade, investment, and strategic alliances now finds itself staring into a future where those pillars no longer hold the same stability. The economic model here has always been premised on security, on control, and on the ability to guarantee a stable environment for foreign capital. Investors put their money into technology, real estate, and infrastructure on the assumption that tomorrow would look much like today. But tonight has shown that assumption to be fragile. When the flow of capital senses instability, it moves with speed, sometimes overnight. The foundation of stability for investment and trade has been shaken, undermining long held economic assumptions. For years, the model rested on a perception of resilience and control, one that reassured both domestic and foreign investors that the risks of placing capital in this economy were contained. Stability was treated not as a variable, but as a constant, a permanent feature of the environment that allowed companies to sign long-term contracts, financial institutions to project steady growth, and governments to plan budgets with confidence. That perception, once fractured, does not simply bend, it begins to erode the very trust upon which modern economies rely. Investors, whether they are multinational corporations, regional partners, or local entrepreneurs, make decisions not just on profits, but on the predictability of tomorrow. A system that looks vulnerable invites hesitation. Suddenly, investments that once seemed secure carry new layers of risk. A housing development planned for international clients may now face canceled bookings. A technology venture expecting inflows of venture capital may see those funds diverted elsewhere. Even the currency can become a victim of shaken confidence as capital flees in search of safer havens. The breakdown is not immediate collapse. It is a gradual loss of faith, the kind that seeps into every contract, every transaction, every calculation of future returns. Trade operates on similar assumptions. Goods flow because businesses on both sides of a border trust that delivery will be made, payments will clear, and routes will remain open. When uncertainty takes hold, trade routes become fragile. Exporters find their partners questioning reliability. Importers pay higher premiums to secure shipments. Insurance costs rise for goods in transit. The disruption may begin as logistical challenges, but it quickly morphs into lost market share as buyers turn toward alternative suppliers in other countries. Competitors stand ready to fill the void, and once relationships are broken in trade, they are not easily rebuilt. Underlying all of this is the broader assumption that markets crave order above all else. They do not demand justice. They do not demand equality, but they demand predictability. For years, the perception was that predictability here was guaranteed. It was the invisible asset underpinning every visible economic achievement. Tonight, that invisible asset has been devalued. And unlike a tangible resource, it cannot be mined, refined, or manufactured overnight. It must be restored, and restoration is far more difficult than preservation. The implications stretch into finance, labor, and production alike. Banks, whose business depends on trust, may find depositors cautious and borrowers hesitant. Lending slows, investment contracts, and a feedback loop develops where the very tools designed to generate growth become paralyzed by caution. The labor force, long accustomed to steady expansion in industries like technology, manufacturing, and construction, faces the anxiety of contraction. Layoffs or stalled hiring ripple through households, dampening consumption and further weakening the domestic economy. What once was a virtuous cycle of growth risks turning into a vicious cycle of retrenchment. Foreign investors, who often provide the spark for innovation and expansion, will weigh the new risks carefully. Some may remain, but many will demand higher returns to compensate for perceived instability. Higher expected returns translate into higher costs of borrowing, reducing competitiveness and squeezing businesses already navigating tighter margins. Over time, this can alter the structural makeup of the economy, shifting it from one that thrived on inflows of external capital to one struggling to attract even cautious partners. It is also important to note that economic assumptions are not only about numbers on balance sheets. They shape social expectations. A society that has grown used to steady improvements in living standards, rising property values, and expanding opportunities for upward mobility begins to expect these conditions as natural. When that trajectory is disrupted, it generates disillusionment, anger, and pressure on institutions to provide answers. Economic instability, once visible in statistics, becomes lived reality in households and communities. That shift transforms what might appear as a financial issue into a deeply political one. The erosion of long held assumptions therefore strikes at two levels. At the surface, it affects contracts, investments, and trade flows. Beneath the surface, it undermines the trust that holds together the social contract between a state and its citizens and between a nation and the global marketplace. Once shaken, that trust is not easily restored, and its absence creates ripple effects across every sector of economic life. Financial markets, exports, and the domestic economy will each feel immediate and compounding pressures. Financial markets are the most sensitive, often reacting within hours or even minutes to signals of instability. They are not patient observers, but rather rapid calculators of risk, shifting capital at extraordinary speed when assumptions change. The stock market, which has been an important reflection of economic confidence, may begin to register volatility not only in sectors directly tied to security concerns, but across the entire spectrum of industries. Technology firms, construction companies, energy providers all depend on a perception of long term stability, and when that perception falters, valuations adjust downward. Currency markets, likewise, respond almost instantly. A weakened currency increases import costs, fuels inflation, and creates pressure on households as the value of wages erodes against rising prices. Investors, both foreign and domestic, may seek safer assets elsewhere, leaving the national economy to cope with the outflow. Exports, the second layer of impact, function as both an economic lifeline and a symbol of competitiveness. A nation that has built its reputation on high value exports, be it in technology, agriculture, or specialized industries, relies heavily on the trust of foreign buyers. When global partners sense instability, they do not always sever ties immediately, but they begin to diversify. Orders that once flowed consistently may be rerouted incrementally to alternative suppliers in neighboring countries or even distant markets. Insurance premiums on shipments can rise, delivery schedules become uncertain, and logistics networks face added scrutiny. Every additional cost reduces competitiveness and every delay pushes buyers to reconsider their dependence on a single source. Once trust erodes in export relationships, regaining market share is far more difficult than simply replacing lost contracts. Competitors are always eager to step in, and global trade rarely offers second chances to those who fall behind. The domestic economy absorbs these pressures in more direct and visible ways. As financial markets weaken and exports shrink, ordinary households encounter the consequences. Rising prices for imported goods, from food to fuel, hit consumers quickly. Inflation does not simply reflect in abstract economic data, but in daily struggles to meet expenses, in reduced purchasing power, and in diminished savings. At the same time, industries facing uncertainty may slow down hiring, delay wage increases, or even turn to layoffs. Workers who once had confidence in expanding opportunities now face insecurity, and insecurity dampens consumption. Lower consumption, in turn, constrains businesses that rely on domestic demand, creating another cycle of contraction. Small and medium enterprises, which often lack the resources to withstand prolonged shocks, are especially vulnerable. They depend on credit, on reliable supply chains, and on steady consumer demand. When financial institutions become cautious, supply chains disrupted, and consumers constrained, these enterprises find themselves squeezed from all sides. Many may close, adding to unemployment and deepening the strain on communities. The larger corporations may endure longer, but even they adjust by scaling back expansion, limiting investments, and conserving capital, further slowing economic momentum. Beyond immediate pressures, there is a compounding effect as these dynamics feed into one another. Weakness in financial markets leads to higher borrowing costs, which makes it more difficult for exporters to finance new contracts. Declining exports reduce foreign currency inflows, putting additional pressure on the exchange rate and increasing inflation. Inflation erodes purchasing power, which reduces domestic demand and increases the stress on financial institutions holding consumer debt. Each sector does not merely suffer in isolation, it amplifies the difficulties of the others. The result is not a linear decline, but a spiraling challenge that requires extraordinary effort to halt. Tourism, often an overlooked but significant sector, also contracts sharply in times of instability. Visitors, whether for business or leisure, are highly sensitive to perceptions of risk. Cancellations in flights, reservations, and conferences send ripples across airlines, hotels, restaurants, and service industries. The loss is not only in revenue, but in the reputation that sustains the tourism industry for years. As fewer people arrive, foreign currency inflows decline further, intensifying pressure on the balance of payments and limiting the ability of the economy to cushion itself against shocks. The labor market, already under strain from slowing exports and weak financial markets, bears additional pressure from tourism losses and the contraction of small enterprises. Rising unemployment or underemployment creates not only economic but also social instability. Households that lose their income reduce consumption even further, deepening the downturn. Governments, faced with rising demands for social support at the same time revenues decline, encounter fiscal dilemmas. Borrowing becomes more expensive as investors demand higher returns, while austerity risks fueling social discontent. The fiscal position, once manageable, becomes precarious as public spending is forced to rise just as the capacity to fund it declines. All these pressures ultimately converge on the central question of resilience. An economy can weather shocks if it has reserves of trust, capital, and productive flexibility. But when financial markets, exports, and the domestic economy are all under simultaneous stress, resilience is tested to its limits. The pressures do not simply coexist, they compound each other, feeding into cycles of inflation, contraction, and uncertainty. The very architecture of growth, built over years of stable assumptions, faces the risk of unraveling under the weight of interconnected crises. Regional competitors are poised to benefit as trade corridors shift and new hubs attract capital. When instability strikes in one part of the world, global markets do not stand still, they redirect. Investors, traders, and producers seek alternatives, and those alternatives often become the unexpected winners in moments of disruption. In this case, countries nearby or those with developing infrastructure projects will be the first to position themselves as replacements. They will offer stability, logistical access, and competitive pricing to partners who now hesitate to place all their reliance on a single, uncertain market. Global trade operates like a vast river system, constantly searching for the most efficient channels. When one route becomes blocked or unreliable, the flow simply diverts elsewhere. Shipping companies, airlines, and freight providers have no loyalty to any particular corridor. Their loyalty is to profit and predictability. If insurance rates climb for one set of ports, alternative ports immediately appear more attractive. If roads, railways, or pipelines in one country face heightened risks, others in the region advertise their own networks as secure and ready for expansion. This redirection is not just temporary. Once infrastructure contracts are signed, once ports and corridors become integrated into global logistics, trade rarely returns to its old routes. Even if stability is later restored, for capital the logic is similar. Money seeks security, growth potential, and a clear regulatory framework. When an economy signals fragility, investors quickly scan the horizon for other destinations. In this case, regional competitors that have been building financial centers, technology zones, and industrial parks will seize the opportunity to market themselves as safe harbors. They will emphasize political stability, incentives for foreign investment, and long-term development plans. For capital that was once concentrated, diversification will now become the safer strategy, and competitors will be eager to absorb the flows. Energy markets in particular reveal how these shifts occur. Countries with growing production capacity or transit routes for oil and gas immediately step into the spotlight when one player becomes uncertain. Long-term contracts for supply are re-examined, and buyers negotiate with new suppliers who can guarantee delivery without the same geopolitical risks. The shift of energy flows has ripple effects, infrastructure investments move with them, trade partnerships deepen around them, and political alliances begin to realign. A nation that once enjoyed leverage as a critical energy partner may find itself sidelined as competitors step forward with fewer perceived risks. Tourism and services also play a role in this rebalancing. Visitors who avoid one destination often select another within the same region. Conferences, academic exchanges, and cultural events are relocated to nearby countries that present themselves as both safe and open. Airlines reroute, hotels adapt, and service industries in alternative markets benefit from inflows that were never originally theirs. what appears at first as a temporary adjustment can evolve into permanent preference as new destinations establish reputations that endure beyond the immediate crisis. The role of regional blocs becomes central in this process. Countries with membership in economic alliances or trade unions will promote themselves as part of a larger, stable system, contrasting themselves against the uncertainty of a single unstable state. These blocs, whether regional trade agreements or development partnerships, reassure investors that risks are pooled and managed collectively. When trade corridors shift, it is often to the benefit of such blocs, which can offer larger markets and integrated logistics compared to any one country acting alone. Meanwhile, competitors also strengthen their soft power as they absorb the attention of businesses and governments seeking stability. Diplomatic initiatives, business forums, and development projects all gain traction not because of extraordinary innovation, but simply because they occupy the space left open by instability elsewhere. This creates a feedback loop where capital inflows fund further development attracts more investment, and influence grows steadily without dramatic effort. It is also crucial to recognize that these shifts rarely reverse. Once multinational corporations move production facilities or logistics centers to new locations, they seldom uproot them again. Even if the original market regains stability, supply chains are expensive to build, contracts are long-term, and efficiency improves with experience. Competitors know this, and they work quickly to lock in new relationships, offering tax breaks, infrastructure support, and workforce training to ensure that the diversion of capital becomes permanent. Thus, the instability of one nation becomes the opportunity of another. Regional competitors will not only replace lost trade, but also strengthen their own long-term positions in global markets. As they attract investment, they diversify their economies, build stronger institutions, and accumulate influence. What was once a centralized hub of economic and strategic power becomes one among many, forced to compete rather than dominate. This redistribution of economic weight transforms the region itself, creating a more multipolar landscape where influence is spread across several emerging centers instead of concentrated in one. Rising public spending amid shrinking revenues risks triggering a cycle of contraction, discontent, and deeper instability. Governments facing sudden instability almost always react with greater expenditure, particularly in areas tied to defense, emergency relief, and infrastructure repair. These are politically unavoidable costs, demanded both by circumstance and by public expectation. Citizens confronted with insecurity insist on stronger protections, while industries disrupted by shocks require state support to keep functioning. Yet, at the very same time, the inflows that typically finance such spending, tax revenues, foreign investment, and export earnings, are under strain. This widening gap between commitments and resources forms the starting point of a fiscal dilemma that can reshape an economy for years. When revenues fall, the first source governments often turn to is borrowing. But borrowing in an environment of instability comes at a price. Credit rating agencies adjust their outlooks, lenders demand higher interest rates, and debt servicing consumes an ever larger share of the budget. What begins as a short-term fix turns into a structural burden, with future growth constrained by the need to pay yesterday's bills. Public projects, social services, and long-term investments get squeezed as resources are diverted to cover rising debt costs. In this way, attempts to restore stability through spending can paradoxically weaken the very foundations of fiscal resilience. Taxes are another lever, but they carry their own risks. Increasing taxes during a period of economic uncertainty often backfires, as households already facing inflation and job insecurity see their disposable income shrink further. Consumption falls, businesses cut back, and tax revenues do not increase as expected. Higher corporate taxes may drive firms to relocate, particularly when neighboring countries are positioning themselves as more stable alternatives. This erosion of the tax base deepens the fiscal gap, forcing governments to make difficult choices between raising taxes further, cutting services, or borrowing more heavily. Public spending, meanwhile, has a tendency to expand beyond its initial scope. Emergency programs designed to stabilize prices, support industries, or subsidize essential goods can quickly become entrenched. Once citizens experience subsidies on fuel, food, or housing, it is politically difficult to withdraw them, even when fiscal pressures mount. What begins as temporary relief often becomes a permanent line item, draining resources long after the immediate crisis has passed. At the same time, inefficiencies and corruption can creep into hastily launched programs, further reducing their effectiveness and adding to the fiscal strain. The consequences of this imbalance are not confined to government accounts, they reverberate throughout society. Inflation rises as governments finance deficits through monetary expansion, reducing the real value of wages and savings. Unemployment increases as businesses, facing both higher costs and weaker demand, cut back on labor. Social inequality widens, since wealthier groups can shield themselves through access to foreign assets or stable currencies, while lower income households absorb the brunt of higher prices and reduced services. As discontent spreads, pressure builds for governments to respond with even more spending, deepening the cycle further. International markets also play a decisive role. Investors, both private and institutional, watch fiscal signals closely. A government perceived as losing control of its budget faces capital flight, currency depreciation, and declining foreign direct investment. Multilateral institutions may intervene with loans or aid packages, but these often come with conditions requiring austerity measures. Austerity, in turn, ignites public anger as subsidies are withdrawn, wages frozen, and services reduced. Thus, the fiscal crisis transforms into a social and political one, with instability no longer confined to financial charts, but expressed in protests, strikes, and rising polarization. The broader economy struggles under the weight of this cycle. Infrastructure development slows as funds are redirected to immediate needs. Education and healthcare, which require long-term stability of funding, suffer cutbacks, undermining human capital and reducing productivity over time. The private sector, which depends on predictable policy and steady demand, becomes cautious, withholding investment until clarity returns. Growth stagnates, innovation stalls, and opportunities for expansion shift abroad. What began as a response to instability evolves into an embedded weakness, one that limits future prospects even if external conditions improve. The long-term risk is not simply economic contraction, but the erosion of institutional credibility. Citizens begin to doubt whether the government can deliver stability. Investors question whether commitments will be honored, and international partners reassess whether cooperation remains reliable. Once credibility is lost, it cannot be restored by announcements or short-term spending. It requires years of disciplined policy, consistent performance, and a rebuilding of trust across society and global markets. Yet, in the middle of a fiscal crisis, the temptation is always to prioritize immediate survival over long term credibility, a choice that may calm today's pressures while magnifying tomorrow's burdens. Thus, the convergence of rising expenditures and shrinking revenues does not remain a technical issue of budgets. It transforms into a self reinforcing cycle in which each attempt at resolution introduces new pressures. Spending to calm insecurity deepens deficits, deficits weakened growth reduces revenues, and the spiral continues. What emerges is not just an economic challenge, but a test of the resilience of both the fiscal system and the society it supports, with the risks of deeper instability growing as each round of this cycle unfolds.